A very good evening to you. You're watching Biz First in Focus on TV1. What are we going to discuss today and who are we going to talk to? The small and medium scale enterprises in our country have not been looked into by the government properly. That is an allegation raised by the small and medium scale enterprises operating here in Sri Lanka. However, the Pathfinder Foundation and the German government have got together and given us some experts from Germany to look at how their country went ahead after the war, the Second World War, and secured the trust of the small and medium scale enterprises and how they developed that sector after the war, or the post-war development of the small and medium scale enterprises in Germany. So we got hold of one expert panelist brought down by the Pathfinder Foundation, Professor Rolf J. Langhammer. He has been working in consultation with a number of international agencies like the European Union, like the Asian Development Bank, and even the United Nations. So a very good evening to you, sir.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. First of all, let me ask you a question on, let me draw a parallel. Germany was struck by war in the 40s, and then Sri Lanka also had a 30-year war. Nothing compared to what Germany had to undergo, but definitely war is war. It creates havoc and wreaks havoc wherever it is. However, Germany has been able to take a step forward, look ahead from the war, and develop its small and medium scale industries. What lessons has Germany taken into consideration when you took that step forward?
Well, I think the job was not overly difficult because the institutional structure, the knowledge, the technological skills were all available. What was lacking after the Second World War was the capital for build-up companies, plants, infrastructure. That was provided by the Marshall Fund, by the US, for total Europe, but also especially for Germany. And in this respect, of course, that bottleneck, which sole bottleneck of lacking capital, could be overcome very rapidly, and everything else was in place.
With regard to, once again, obviously Sri Lanka too receives foreign aid, receives funds from foreign countries. Right. What did Germany consider when actually allocating these foreign aids? Like you said, the Marshall Fund. How did the governments back then know where to allocate this money properly? What points did you consider?
Well, the bottlenecks were clear, of course. All the companies had good ideas after the Second World War to provide new products to the world and to the local population. Of course, the bottlenecks were also inside because when people suffered from lack of housing, lack of infrastructure. So that, of course, that bottleneck was filled rapidly. The situation is a bit difficult and more different in Sri Lanka, because there are other bottlenecks, not only, of course, lack of capital, but, of course, lack of skills. And the situation, of course, has totally changed since the last 60 years. Today, the world is globalized.
Yes.
Sri Lanka is a small, open economy, and it is still, after getting the peace dividend of settling the disputes on the war, is still, of course, enjoying the peace dividend. But Sri Lanka, given its small size, is too less engaged in world-class first exports. I think this is still the case. It is a small country. It should export more. It should provide more skilled resources to the world in terms of services, maybe also in agriculture. And for that, of course, it needs to develop its potential. Including, of course, infrastructure endowment, including, of course, the building up of new capital stock, but especially investing in the people.
When it comes to small and medium scale enterprises here in our country, they're more on the they're more on the informal sector of things. Right. So when they go to a bank to obtain a loan for their startup or for their initial capital, they will have issues because they're, as I said, in the informal sector. What developments can Sri Lanka learn? Now, I know that you had a successful conference yesterday as well, but what are the points that Sri Lanka can grasp right then and there to develop the SMEs? Well,
the access to finance is a very serious bottleneck, of course, and we discussed that over the conference. There are lots of approaches from small banks, from microcredits, also from international institutions to help to ease that bottleneck. But of course, it is very important to develop the formal financial sector, to make that sector resilient against crisis. That is very important. So prevent that these banks got over-leveraged in external debt. And that would also help them to give more credit and more loans to the small and medium-sized enterprises. So my advice would be first strengthen the formal sector, the formal financial sector. Try to merge that sector with the informal financial sector, and in order to make that sector, financial sector, a bit larger. And the larger the sector is, the more easier it is, of course, also for small and medium-sized enterprises to have collateral, and with that collateral to get loans.
However, this merger that you speak of, the formal-informal merger, is not an easy thing to do. Even for a small economy like Sri Lanka, we had to go through a process. How do you suggest that we can do something like this?
Well, of course, you need support from international agencies. You may open up also to international financial institutions, to private institutions as well as public ones. And of course, it is absolutely necessary to strengthen the financial capacity of the small and medium-sized enterprises, especially their equity base. So we know from the German experiences that family-owned small and medium-sized enterprises usually have a better equity base. So they are not so much dependent on loans, and to strengthen the equity base would be a very strong support and help for these enterprises, then in addition to get access to loans.
When you take a look at these small and medium-scale enterprises here in the local economy, they are very much away from the main economic system. They are in their small clusters, and the information of the economy that they receive may be delayed or a little too late. So how do you suggest that we can create this integration between these SMEs? How did Germany do it after the war?
Well, the German small and medium-sized enterprises actually are fairly large, sometimes more than 500 employees with a turnover of sometimes more than 2 billion euro and so on. So they are, of course, medium-sized, but of course they have a lot of skills, and they were specialized in niches, and they were looking for links to their main customers.
Right.
If these main customers are also internationally oriented, maybe a company from Sri Lanka exporting goods or services to the world, this company, of course, should look for clients and customers within the local small and medium-sized enterprises. That would be the best idea. And as that big company is already flourishing, of course, why not buying and selling, of course, from and to these small and medium-sized enterprises? So the link, of course, between the two groups is not an easy thing to overcome, but it is possible if a successful investor in Sri Lanka already exporting to the world looks for new sources of intermediates, spare goods, and may perhaps find them in the small and medium-sized local sector. And so, of course, these are costs of information. This informational gap between the two groups, that must be bridged by external help, maybe by chambers of commerce, by international institutions. So in this respect, of course, support also from a country like Germany is possible. But of course, it is the task of the company, of the successful company, to look for sources from local small and medium-sized enterprises. And if we are successful, we will do that.
Professor, with that we have to go into a short commercial break. We are in discussion with Professor Rolf J. Langhammer about the SMEs in our country and how Germany developed post-war. We'll be talking to Professor continuously about this topic. Stay with Biz First in Focus. Good evening, welcome back to the show. You are watching Biz First in Focus. I am in discussion with Professor Rolf J. Langhammer, all the way from Germany. He has come here to educate the Sri Lankan SMEs on how to develop itself, and Professor has brought the experience of post-war Germany here to Sri Lanka so that we also can learn from their lessons, and they are here to share their information with us. We were in discussion with the Professor about the development of SMEs here in our country. Professor, I want to continue from where we stopped. You had a successful conference yesterday, a roundtable discussion on social market economics as well as the SMEs. What are the key findings of yesterday's conference in terms of Sri Lanka?
The key finding are two things. First of all, training and recruitment of young people which is a very big stronghold and asset of German small and medium-sized companies, is essential for Sri Lanka. You know, the German example shows that these German companies are strongly rooted and anchored in their local environment.
Right.
They have traditionally very strong contacts to schools. They try to go into the schools, attract people to take apprenticeships or internments in the companies. So in order to provide, let's say, a further flow of skilled people into the companies from the local environment, I think this is one example which I think is worth to be looked upon in Sri Lanka, and we had also very positive response yesterday on the conference from our local counterparts.
What other obstacles do we have? The SMEs here in Sri Lanka, here in our country, we have problems with regard to the job security. If a youth or a young person goes into this sector of a small and medium scale business, they would worry about their job security. Yeah. Then there is the lack of policy from the government's point of view. So what more can we do to ensure that these youth, obviously we are talking about providing jobs to the people here. So what can we do to ensure that they are safe in their mind to go and start or join an SME in that sense?
Sometimes we have to change or influence their mindset. Many young people, of course, would like to go to the government sector.
Definitely.
This is definitely also the case in Germany. Many people would like to study first, not going into apprenticeship. There's a tendency, and we discussed it yesterday over the conference, that this tendency is very strong. Everybody would like to study instead of going work. So you extend, of course, your academic career at the price of being involved in the private sector. So this, I think, is something what, of course, the incentives come from may save income in the government sector, may come from safe pension schemes in the government sector. So you have a split labor market. The government sector is one sector, and you know that Sri Lanka is traditionally a relatively strongly state-driven economy. That has to be, let's say, modified. I wouldn't say radically changed. It has to be modified. There should be more incentives for young people to go to the private sector. And the motivation should be encouraged by lots of, of internships. Of course, also some sort of income gain from these internships. There's also the example of Germany, because these people earn money already over internships and apprenticeships. And then, of course, they should also go to school, which is our dual system in Germany, go to school at the same time working into the companies. Right. And let's say promoting these schools and bringing the right teachers who give them the theoretical background, maybe for a mechatronic worker, in addition to what he learns on the job. This, I think, is a requirement which is not yet met in Sri Lanka.
There are a lot of youth in our country who wants to innovate things, who wants to go into that aspect of things, but there are various barriers put out by the set up by the government, financially. Let's look at the government at this instance. Does Germany have the same type of barriers, or are we having more barriers? What's going on? Why aren't these youthful people not getting into the business?
Well, we have similarities between Germany and Sri Lanka, though, of course, the income differential is huge, of course. Also in Germany, as I said before, many young people, of course, are intrigued by the public sector.
Right.
Then they see that, of course, they can earn quite a lot of money in the private sector, whereas in the public sector, your income is safe, but very modest. So to give more transparency on what are your chances and your career possibilities in the private sector relative to the public sector, that would be one way to do it, of course, to have more transparency on what you can do. Innovation, of course, are two things. One is a process innovation. You do things more effectively. And I think this will be the first step for people in Sri Lanka. They have ideas. Hey, I have a certain process of producing something. I have an idea how to make it more effectively, using less resources and so on. So this is a process innovation. What is more difficult, these are the brightest ideas. This is product innovation. You find a new product, a brand new product. And that is something, for that you need, of course, loans, because you have a business model. That's probably more difficult. So for the young chaps to start with, I think we should give them any sort of rewards, any sort of incentives to go into process innovation and to look into the process of a company and saying, hey, you are young, what would you change? We have a problem with the inputs. Inputs, we have to import these inputs. How can we substitute for them for local inputs? How can we use less resources in the past? We want to have sustainable production.
Right.
That is, of course, the thing. So give them the right questions, and I think the young people will also find the right answers.
As you said, incentives have driven our economy when it comes to the elections as well. However, it is important that these people get incentives. However, at the end of all this, once they have a product, once they have their SME running, it is important that they have access to different markets as well. How do we achieve this in terms of getting their product across to the market locally, internationally, domestically? How do we do this?
Well, first of all, it will start with the local market. But, you know, Sri Lanka is fairly small, and I think it should be much more important to go into an international market. For that, you need access to international fairs, your international investors, and of course you have to look what can Sri Lanka offer. I think, for instance, give you an example, ecotourism is something for which many people in Europe and also from the US or Japan would pay a lot of money to say, hey, we would like to have a premium style, not mass tourism, but premium style of tourism, saying how can we preserve biodiversity? How can you explain us the functioning of mangrove jungles, which you still have, and so on. So for this, of course, which creates a lot of jobs, and has, of course, a upskilled premium segment of tourists, not only simple mass tourists. I think this would be a good idea. I was asked yesterday, which country would you compare with Sri Lanka, which went this way? And I came to the idea that the country of Costa Rica in Central America is such a country. It's also a small country. It has specialized in high-quality ecotourism, for instance, and makes a lot of money with that. It is open-minded, it's friendly, people speak English, of course, as this is the case in Sri Lanka, and it is a stable country, it's politically stable, that's also important, has a fairly good infrastructure. So in this respect, small is beautiful, and for that country like Costa Rica, I would say, yes, why not looking at the experiences of that country and saying how can we adopt that to the Sri Lankan situation and bring also that type of service in it. Wellness is a service. Health services could be important. We are living all in Europe in an aging society. People would, of course, would like to go on wellness tour, on a wellness holiday. And in this respect, I think there are lots of skills here in Sri Lanka to provide that service.
With that, we will go into another short commercial break. Stay with us. You're watching Biz First in Focus. Welcome back to the show. You're watching Biz First in Focus. We are having an interesting chat with Professor Langhammer all the way from Germany about the SMEs in our country. Without keeping you waiting, I'm going to talk to Professor and ask him where we left off again. Professor, when it comes to SMEs and the development of SMEs in a country like Sri Lanka, we have a problem with regard to the infrastructure that is provided to them, be it electricity, be it other facilities in our country. The government also has to take a look at this and say we have to develop these SMEs because there is a high electricity cost that would increase the production cost, and then there is an issue of the salaries, the wages, and so on and so forth. So where does the government have to stand when it comes to the development of SMEs in our country?
Well, the government has, first of all, to provide a safe access to public goods like electricity, water supply, and so on. But of course, the prices do matter. And we were told yesterday at the conference that these prices, especially for electricity, not for telecom, but for electricity, are fairly high.
Yes.
There's a monopoly. So monopolies always charge higher prices. The experience of Germany is, I don't want to say, okay, I don't want to sell it to Sri Lanka, but I just tell you about the experiences in Germany is where we have the state ownership on the grid of the electricity, But there's competition in the sense that there can be many more suppliers than only one company providing energy. So every consumer of energy and electricity can easily switch from one supplier to the other. That's easy. Where the grid stays in the property of the state. And this is possible, and that of course lowers the prices, though not so many people switch easily from day to day, but it's possible. So that is one case. Monopolies should be prevented. The state can continue to regulate access to these resources, but of course the prices must be lowered. The problem with the wages and salaries is a general one in Sri Lanka. As a state-driven economy, prices and wages are very much influenced by the governmental sector. Economists call that a distorted exchange rate, because the exchange rate is a bit too high, and there's a discussion, of course, from the central bank to have, let's say, a gradual adjustment of nominal exchange rate in order to make Sri Lankan products internationally more competitive. That is a challenge. It comes at a price, because any depreciation of a currency brings, of course, import prices up. Fortunately enough, Sri Lanka at the moment benefits from low commodity prices, which you have to import. So it lowers the import bill. You can do that at the moment. That's good.
Yes. With regard to, now we looked at this from the point of the SMEs. If you look at it from the point of the government, in Sri Lanka there seems to be a lack of policy from the government's point of view, be it like we said, the energy sector. There is a lack of policy in the energy sector, lack of policy from the foreign exchange point of view. So there is a lack of policy. Is this important, the certainty of policies when it comes to developing SMEs?
It's terribly important. We call that the framework conditions. The state must provide, and must not be a big state, but it must be an efficient and effective state. It should concise its functions on various public goods which are necessary. And of course, the state has the task to broaden the tax base. That is a serious problem in Sri Lanka.
Right.
The tax base is too narrow. Too few people pay taxes, maybe too high. They feel overtaxed. So broadening tax base, strengthening the tax administration in order to allow for a steady flow of tax revenues into the government, which is very important, because Sri Lanka suffers from a fiscal deficit which is fairly high compared to international standards, and that could of course also lead the country, maybe if situations externally change, into something like a debt crisis. So I think that is the task of the government, to broaden the tax base, to make the tax revenues safer and more reliable, strengthen the administration on the one hand, and second, on the expenditure side, take care especially of those people who are, let's say, less fortunate enough, more handicapped, more living in the remote areas. So everything which we call inclusive growth, that means growth which takes explicitly account of the poorer people, that is the task on the expenditure side.
In the banking sector, if you look at the banking sector, as we earlier spoke, there is a certain reluctancy to provide loans to these startup companies, to the small, medium-scale enterprises. Should there be a change in attitude there as well? What do you think about that?
In a private market economy, you cannot simply say to the banks, okay, you are now obliged to give more loans to the small holders or to the small and medium-sized enterprises. I think there should be support from that, and there's international support, especially also from international aid institutions, to support local banks giving loans to these people and to these small companies. But of course, there should also be mechanism to lower the so-called enforcement costs of giving loans. That means that the collateral should be taken into account. There should be a follow-up. These companies should be trained to have good accounts and a clear settlement of their revenues and their expenditure. So helping them to provide a solid base as a collateral, that would be the task of the banks, and if that could be achieved, then also the banks would be provided to give more loans.
I'm not sure how many people were present at, how many public representatives or politicians were present at your discussion yesterday. So let me ask you to give our politicians, policymakers, if they are watching this program, any message from your point of view to them in terms of developing SMEs in our country?
Well, first of all, SMEs, I think this is important, are the backbone of each economy. And each politician should have that in his mind or in her mind, that without SMEs, an economy would struggle and would really be defeating. So in this respect, SMEs are of extremely high importance. Second, of course, it's not so good to give always tax subsidies. So if we have to decide between tax subsidies or giving direct financial contributions, it's better to give them direct financial contributions rather than, let's say, giving them privileges to be exempted from taxes and so on. Right. So that is our experience. Better give them direct financial contributions rather than giving them tax privileges. The third one, of course, is the skills. You need to, the government and the policymakers should need, of course, to bring schools and the companies together and try to bridge the gap between the private and the public sector. I think this is also very much important. And the government sector and politicians should, of course, look also at their constituencies and saying that a successful private sector in their constituency is also a very good base to be re-elected. This is something which every politician should consider, and it, of course, usually it's very helpful.
Maybe at least they'll take that point into consideration and do something in our country. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us on Biz First in Focus. It was lovely talking to you about the small and medium scale enterprise in our country. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Once again, we will join you next week as well with an interesting guest like Professor Langhammer. Stay with us. I'm Saturanga Puarachi. Take care.